Okay, we're going to start our webinar, Silence is Not Spiritual, in just a few minutes. We're just going to wait a few minutes and give people a chance to join. Okay, assalamu alaikum everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining the webinar today. We're going to talk about abuse and breaking the silence. I know that there are a lot of people today in Virginia who have lost power, and I just want to pray for everybody's safety, and also hope that if you've lost power, you get it restored back soon. The webinar will be recorded so that you'll be able to access it later. But thank you for those who have joined. I'm going to talk today about something that is really important to me, and I think that there's, while everybody understands that there's abuse and the different types of abuse, what I want to focus on today is some of the nuances to help us really understand like the impact and what we can do to make a difference. For those of you who are new to Peaceful Families Project, I just want you to know a little bit about what we do. We're a national nonprofit. We focus on ending abuse with a particular focus on Muslim communities. Today I'm going to be speaking about abuse in a broader sense than domestic violence, which is what we normally focus on. And I would invite you today to listen, keeping in mind the Quranic description of believing men and believing women being partners, mutual friends, and protectors of one another. And this is from chapter 9, verse 71. And as you listen, I just want you to consider how we can join forces as men and women as people from different parts of the community to make this world a safer place for us, for our children, simply by saying no to abuse, whether it occurs in the workplace, in the home, or in the mosque. Okay, so the secret's out. Everybody knows now that abuse happens, right? We all know it happens between intimate partners. We know it happens in the workplace. We know it happens in the mosque, in churches, and synagogues. It also happens during holy rituals like the pilgrimage to Mecca. It happens on the metro. It happens in taxi cabs. It can happen anywhere. All the high-profile cases that we've heard recently with celebrities, athletes, government officials, you name it. And then there are the campaigns like the Me Too movement that's really made it almost impossible for people to deny the prevalence of these types of abuses. We have the other campaigns too, like the hashtag Church Too movement, the Mosque Me Too, the No More campaign that focuses on domestic violence. And while we typically will look to our leadership to take a stand and to make a difference in our laws and our policies, we also know from the powerful effect the Me Too movement has had that we can make a difference as individuals simply by speaking up and coming forward. We know that leadership is not always the best place to start. Our President of the United States was elected despite the vulgarity, the crudeness, the sexual assault, groping of women, and we can see that the campaigns that people are starting and participating in are making a difference with people losing their jobs, people being held accountable, but there's so much more that we still need to do. So what I'm going to be asking you all to do is, as you listen to this webinar, that you think about what you as an individual can do, one thing that you might do differently that can make a difference in this movement to end all forms of abuse. So even though at a national level we can see all of these different kinds of abuses playing out, we see the different kinds of victims and perpetrators, there are a lot of sort of complexities and nuances that people really struggle to understand. And this lack of understanding is reflected when you hear somebody say something like, well, maybe she asked for it, or, well, what took her so long to report? Why are people coming forward after, 10 years or 15 years? Or, if an accusation is made about a particular public figure or a religious figure, but he's such a kind person, or he's such a good person, or he's done so much for our organization, how could he possibly have done that? Maybe she misunderstood. Maybe she contributed. Maybe she's exaggerating. Or maybe, people making these accusations are jealous and trying to bring this person down. We hear all of these comments, and they are not only unhelpful, they're completely inappropriate, and they reflect a type of, denial, dismissal, and even victim blaming, which is another form of abuse too. So, when we have like egregious violations where a person has bruises or broken bones as a result of, domestic violence, or, if we have a case where there's forensic evidence that confirms a person has been raped, then it may be more likely that we see consequences being taken against the perpetrator and that the victim is supported. But there are so many other types of abuse and cases where even when the abuse is captured on video, like in the Ray Rice example a couple years back, and more recent examples where there's been pictures of, the victims with bruises and proof of their abuse, there are still more concerns sometimes for the perpetrator than there are for the victim. And that really does need to change. We have to stop worrying about the career of the perpetrator and focus more on the safety and well-being of people who are being abused or mistreated. So one of the things that I want to talk about today, because I think it's important in understanding how abuse happens, is the concept of boundaries. And boundaries are basically, a line or a limit. So there's a boundary between the end of my property and the beginning of your property. There's a boundary between my personal space and your personal space. We define our own boundaries, what we are comfortable with as individuals. Then there are, so kind of social norms that determine appropriate boundaries, like what you do when there's 10 people packed in an elevator. So, we tend to look up or at the numbers on the elevator instead of staring at people's faces. These are sort of, ways that we try to maintain our boundaries and respect the other person's, sense of personal space. There's also legal definitions of what are appropriate boundaries. Like I can't walk into my neighbor's house or break into my neighbor's house unless I've been invited. It's called trespassing. So there are boundary violations that are illegal. There are some that are unethical, and there are some that are just a violation of our personal boundaries. When abuse happens, there has been a boundary violation of some sort. And oftentimes there has also been a misuse or abuse of some sort of power or privilege. And so I'm going to be giving some examples that I hope will help you kind of get a feel for the complexities in terms of our emotions, in terms of our responses, that are part of the challenge of dealing with abusive situations. A small example of like a personal boundary would be, how like some people, if they're drinking a cup of coffee and their friend wants to share that cup, they have no problem at all drinking from the same cup. Whereas you may have another friend that will be totally grossed out and may not mind sharing, but it's going to pour some of their coffee into another cup. So that's an example of kind of a personal comfort type of boundary. It's not dictated by laws or anything else. It's just what I'm comfortable with and what you're comfortable with. I'm going to take you, into sort of a visual example. I want you to imagine that we're sitting in a restaurant. And this is a restaurant it's a nice restaurant, it's a high-end restaurant, but the tables are relatively close to each other. And the waiter has just brought you your food, and it smells and it looks amazing. Your mouth is watering just as you prepare to eat it, and you're thinking to yourself, man, I made a really good choice on this menu. Just as you're about to pick up your fork and eat it, you notice that the person at the table next to you has leaned over and now has their fork in your food. And this person says, I'm sure you don't mind sharing, right? Now just stop for a moment and notice your internal reaction. Maybe you're feeling shocked. Maybe you're a little bit confused, like what's happening here? Maybe you're angry because this person has no right to take from your food. Maybe you happen to be a super compassionate person, and so you're thinking, man, this person must have been really hungry to just reach over and eat from my plate. Just kind of notice your internal feelings. And maybe some of the feelings that might be contradictory, so you can have more than one feeling at a time. And now take a moment and ask yourself, okay, if this is me and the person next to me reaches over, puts his fork in my plate and starts eating my food, and I don't even know this person, think about how you're going to respond, because we always have choices of how we're going to respond. Are you going to lean over and hit this person? Are you going to call the waiter and ask to speak to the manager? Are you going to just offer your whole plate to this person and say, okay, here, you eat it? Are you going to invite the person to join you? So these are all possible options, and they reflect sort of the wide range of choices and how you could respond. So let's just imagine for a minute that you do complain to the manager, and the manager says to you, sorry, but you really should have thought about this when you sat so close to this person, or maybe you shouldn't have ordered something that smells so great. Notice what you feel if the manager were to say something like that. Or what if the manager said, what's the big deal? He only took one bite from your food. It's not like he took all of it. And besides, our portions are really generous. There's more than enough for sharing. And wait a minute, doesn't your faith teach you to share with your neighbors? So just pause here for a moment and notice what you're feeling on the inside. Notice the range of emotions that you have. Notice your thoughts. Notice how you might feel inclined to respond. Now let's take this scenario one step further. Let's imagine that the person who leaned over and stuck his fork in your food without asking happens to be your boss. And as you protest and say, hey, why don't you wait for your own food? Or that's not really nice, or I don't really appreciate you doing that. As you start to protest in whatever way that you might protest, what if your boss says, oh, I thought you were a more easygoing and flexible person. Maybe the big project I was thinking of having you lead isn't really a good fit for you after all. You seem to be kind of rigid. Now what do you notice? What has this person just done? What kind of position has this person just put you in? And it's really increased the level of complexity in how you're going to handle this problem. We might all agree that the person who has reached over and put their fork in your food has committed some sort of an offense. It's offensive behavior, it's inappropriate, it's a boundary violation. And if everyone else in the restaurant who has seen it continues to eat their food as if nothing happened, and the manager says what he says, again, making it seem like there's something wrong with you rather than the person who violated the boundary, now these people are kind of complicit. They are complicit, as a matter of fact. They're allowing this bad behavior to continue unchecked. And that's kind of what happens in a lot of cases where people report abuse, whether they're reporting that the spouse or husband is beating his wife or cursing her or intimidating her, whether somebody is saying that their boss is or a colleague is harassing them, or whether someone is complaining that an imam or a religious leader is violating the trust. When we don't say anything, or when we put the blame on the victim, then we are actually part of the problem and we are part of the abusive dynamic. So now let's go to the spiritual context. There are many, many forms of spiritual abuse, and I think that this is an area where some of the terminology hasn't necessarily been very clearly defined. I'm not necessarily going to be able to talk about all the different kinds of abuse, but what I want to focus on is the feelings that get triggered by a person who's in the abusive situation, and our role, what we can do to interrupt these incidents from happening. When people are in an abusive situation where we're talking in a religious or spiritual context, a lot of times people have very conflicted feelings. So just as you were in the restaurant and this person leans over and eats from your food, you're not expecting that to happen. You know there's something wrong with that situation, but you might struggle for a moment. How are you going to respond? What are you going to do about it? And the same happens in any kind of abuse. It's even more confusing when the abuse happens at the hands of somebody that you trust, somebody that you love, somebody that you're being vulnerable with. It's even more complicated. Let's talk about some examples of spiritual abuse. It can range from using or misusing a teaching to manipulate someone's behavior. So for example, in an intimate relationship, in a marriage, if a husband wants to be intimate with his wife and she says she's too tired, she's been up with the baby for 3 or 4 nights, the baby's been sick, she's exhausted, and he quotes a hadith or misquotes a hadith saying that the angels are going to curse you all night, using that as a way to put pressure on her to comply and accommodate his requests. So that is an example of an abuse of religious teachings, and we can call that spiritual abuse. Anytime we're manipulating someone's behavior, trying to get them to do what we want for our benefit, and we're suggesting that somehow they're not a true believer if they don't accommodate our request. they're not generous enough, they're not giving enough, they're not kind enough, they're not accommodating enough, they're not forgiving enough, you name it. The list goes on in terms of how people can really push that guilt button in order to get you to do what you want. And this can happen in between parent and children. It can happen between spouses, between siblings, but people who are really using the religion to get their way, basically. In the case of a religious leader, spiritual abuse can be very, very subtle, and it can also be egregious. I'm just going to give a couple of examples because I won't be able to talk about all of the different kinds of abuse, which is, you know, really runs the gamut. But one example would be if a woman goes to her imam, and you know, you could substitute pastor, priest, rabbi. It all plays out the same way. But a woman goes to her imam or religious leader, and let's say she's complaining about her abusive husband, and she says that she's scared, he beats her, he intimidates her, he's threatened her, and most recently, he threatened to kill her. Now, if the imam says that she should pray, she should turn to God, she should be more patient, and she should reflect on how she could be a better wife. Because obviously, if the husband were happy with her, he would never have engaged in this kind of behavior. So clearly, there must be something wrong with her. If she could just figure out how to be the perfect wife or a better wife, her husband wouldn't have to act like this. So in this case, I hope it's obvious that the imam is guilty of a number of things. First thing, and the most dangerous, is that he's ignoring the risk of lethality. This woman has said her husband has threatened to kill her, and that has been completely ignored. So he has compromised her safety. The imam has also misused teachings about prayer and patience to potentially endanger someone, and also to let the abuser off the hook. I mean, who is the person that really needs to be praying here? Is it the person who is misusing religion or misusing his position to threaten and to intimidate? That's the person whose soul is really more in danger. Obviously, in any situation, we want to pray, we want to ask God for help, for guidance, and we can pray to help us find the resources to get out of the abusive situation. Not necessarily praying to be able to endure the abusive situation. I don't think that's appropriate at all. Let's say the woman really isn't a great wife. Let's say she isn't fulfilling the agreement between the husband and wife. Let's say she's not fulfilling the expectations. Then in that case, the husband has many options in terms of how he wants to handle it. Hitting her and threatening to kill her are not acceptable options at all. They're immoral, they're illegal. If he is really unhappy with her, he can go to counseling, he can bring people in to talk to her. Worst case scenario, he can divorce her if he really isn't happy with her. And he can divorce her in a way that's respectful and in compliance with the Islamic teachings of letting her go in kindness. The imam in this situation has to realize that because he's a religious leader, his advice carries a tremendous amount of weight. And many women will take that advice and they will stay in an abusive relationship, blaming themselves, questioning themselves, what have I done wrong? What do I need to do better? Praying for more patience to endure. And sometimes these cases end because the wife is murdered. And we have, unfortunately, too many of these cases happening around our community. Let's look at another example. Let's say a woman has gone to her imam or her pastor or priest or rabbi, and she's seeking spiritual counseling after her divorce. And she's asking for guidance to deal with her loneliness, which is a pretty natural outcome after divorce. And when she begins to cry, the imam gets up from his chair and he gives her a hug. When she tenses up and backs up, he tells her it's okay. He then tells her that his own marriage is not very good, that he himself is lonely, so he knows exactly how she feels. And then he tells her that he's felt a connection with her from all the work that she's done in the community as a volunteer, and that he really thinks that they could have a good relationship with each other. Just pause for a moment, notice what you're feeling. What are you noticing on the inside when you hear this story? What are the different feelings that come up for you? What are the thoughts that you notice? In this case, the imam is taking advantage of a person who is in a totally vulnerable position. She's trusting him, she's turning to him for guidance, and he's using the situation to prey on her. This is kind of predatory behavior. In this moment, she may feel all of the feelings that you felt when you were in the restaurant and the person leaned over and stuck his fork into your dinner. Maybe she feels shocked, maybe she feels confused, maybe she feels angry, maybe she doesn't even know what to think, maybe she feels compassionate, maybe she's kind of surprised, oh, imams can have problems too, and maybe she feels honored. Wow, you know, the person that's the most sort of pious or religious person in our community has problems too, and is thinking that I can be a comfort to him. All of these things can be coming up in that moment, and it can be really hard to figure out how to deal with it. On top of that, in that moment or afterwards, as she's reviewing the situation in her mind, she could doubt herself. She might ask if she in some way sent mixed signals. Did she somehow invite this behavior? What's her obligation? Is she supposed to now comfort this imam who is obviously also in some kind of pain? It can be really, really confusing. And in the way that our community is now, if she were to share this with people, in the same way that we saw people when people were coming forward complaining about abuse by their religious leaders, the greater community can sometimes react in such a harsh way, blaming the victim, and just because this person is known to be, you know, a religious leader, automatically siding with the religious leader without giving any credence to what the victim is saying. In these examples I've given, it's the woman who's a victim, and in many cases it is. There are, of course, situations where men and boys are also victims, and so I just want to put that out there. There are plenty of examples where boys and men are also preyed upon by people who are in higher positions, whether it's a religious figure, whether it's a boss, and even in some cases it could be a spouse or an intimate partner. The first thing that I want to say to you is that in the same way that you know the person in the restaurant has no business reaching over and putting his fork into your dinner, you know this no matter what the manager says, you know that this is not right. There is something within you, within all of us, that lets us know when something isn't right. And what I'm asking for you is to trust yourself, to trust that part of you that tells you something is off, something is not right, something is not happening the way it's supposed to happen. Trust yourself, and then talk to someone. That's the next step. Talk to somebody who could help you sort through all of these confusing jumble of feelings that might have come up, and somebody who can help you think through what's the appropriate response. Because there are many different kinds of boundary violations, and they occur across a whole, continuum. And as I said in the beginning, it could be just a personal discomfort, and so it's a personal violation. It could be an ethical violation, like when an imam or a religious leader takes advantage of a counseling session to talk about his own marriage problems. It could be illegal, as in the case of domestic violence, stalking, sexual harassment, sexual abuse. These are illegal. So depending on the type of violation, you're going to have a different response. If there's a case of imminent danger, the response always has to be calling the police, calling 911. If it's a case of personal discomfort, there may be ways to handle it, like simply just saying, no, I don't like this, this is making me uncomfortable. And so talking to somebody that you trust, who's not going to judge you, who will really be a good sounding board, can help you figure out the best course of action. And if the first person that you talk to doesn't seem to get what's wrong with the picture, talk to somebody else. Talk to somebody who gets what's wrong with this picture. Many times there's so much confusion that when somebody tells you, well, you were just in the wrong place, or you weren't dressed right, or you didn't speak right, you didn't conduct yourself right, sometimes there's a part of us that believes that, and then we start to blame ourselves. But always remember that if someone has violated a boundary, that person, the person who's violated the boundary, is the person at fault. And the victim cannot be blamed for somebody else's violation. I think it's also really important, and if you don't take away anything else from this webinar, it's that each of us can be part of the solution. Remember the restaurant example? If we're sitting at another table and we see this guy reaching over into somebody else's plate, and we can tell from that person's reaction that this is not okay, if we go on eating our dinner and pretending like nothing is happening, we are complicit. We're kind of agreeing that that behavior is okay by not saying anything about it. Whereas if we say, hey, you know, that's not your place to reach over, or maybe I witness it and I call the waiter and ask for the manager to come over, or maybe after the fact I go over to the person who just had their dinner violated and say, hey, that wasn't right, I'm so sorry that happened to you. Any one of those things conveys and communicates that we disagree with what's happening. Given the statistics on all the different kinds of abuse, whether it's domestic violence, whether it's sexual assault, whether it's abuse in the workplace, it's pretty unlikely that you're going to get through your life without either experiencing some form of abuse yourself or knowing somebody who has experienced abuse or actually witnessing it happening right in front of you. It is incredible how many people don't say anything because they feel uncomfortable, they feel like it's not their business, they worry that it might make things worse, or they think that it's just normal behavior. So abusive behavior, whether it's very subtle or whether it's egregious, will continue to occur until we all work together to put an end to it. From an Islamic perspective, we all have a responsibility to stand up for justice, and the Prophet has told us that we need to stop oppression, whether it's by helping the oppressed person or the abused person, or whether it's by helping the abuser or the oppressor. And when the companions asked him, how do we help the oppressor? He said, by stopping the oppression, by stopping the abuse. So we all have this responsibility in whatever way we can, depending on the circumstance. So if you see something happening in front of you, or you hear about something, the first and easiest thing for you to do is just to say, that's not right. If it's happening in front of you, you can tell the person who's committing the offense that it's not okay, that you're not okay with it. If that's not safe for whatever reason, or it's not appropriate because of the context, you can reach out to the target of the abuse and check on that person, or let them know, validate that you know what happened. They're not crazy. Sometimes people doubt themselves. They start to wonder if they have imagined it or exaggerated what happened. So it's very important, even if you can just reach out and say, I saw that happen and that's not okay. It's also appropriate to make a report. If you witness abuse happening in front of you and perhaps it's not safe for you to intervene, you can call the police, you can call security, you can file a report with the employer if it's happening in the workplace. There is action that you can take, and a lot of times you can take that action anonymously if you need to protect yourself. But take action. The other thing that I want people to really consider doing is to learn about the policies that are in place in your workplace, in your mosque, in your schools. What are the policies in place that protect against abuse? And what are the channels for complaint? Almost every institution has some sort of channels for complaint. And it's important that we know what those are so that we can file a complaint if we need to, or we can advise someone how to file a complaint. I would like to ask everyone to learn more about the different kinds of abuse. There's so much information available to us at our fingertips. Look up spiritual abuse, look up domestic violence, look up sexual harassment. Learn more about this so that you can identify if it's happening to you and you can identify if it's happening to somebody else. If we don't know what these types of abuses are, we won't be able to respond appropriately. There's a story that there was a man who approached the prophet, peace be on him, who wanted permission to commit adultery. And the prophet asked him to imagine how he would feel if another man wanted to commit adultery with his sister or with his wife. And he really used that tool of put yourself in the other person's perspective to help this man understand that while he might be fulfilling his own desire and get gratification from his behavior, but he would be harming somebody else. And so in the same way, I want us all to think about what's it like for the target of abuse? What's it like for the guy who's sitting at the restaurant looking forward to enjoying his meal, and here comes somebody sticking his fork into his meal without permission? How does it feel when you go to work trying to do your job and somebody is either commenting on making sexual comments about your body, touching you inappropriately, and suggesting that you won't get your promotion or you won't keep your job if you don't accommodate these requests? Or when you go to talk to your spiritual leader, your spiritual advisor, your imam, your Quran teacher, and that person then uses the opportunity, instead of allowing you to feel safe, takes advantage of that trust and harms you in some way. So just think about what that's like from the victim's perspective so that we can respond more appropriately in emphasizing the well-being of the victim and the target of the abuse, and then holding the perpetrator accountable in whatever way makes sense based on the situation. I also want you to think about, in your circle of your family, your friends, who are the people that you could trust if something happened to you? Who are the people that you would be able to turn to? And maybe you start having conversations with these people about different scenarios, whether you take it from the news or whether you take it from a movie or whether it's, something that's actually happened to you. And talk about what ifs. What if this happened? What would we do? What should we do? You happen to be a victim or the target of any kind of abuse. Know that it takes a lot of courage to speak up. I know that there can be a lot of repercussions in speaking up. And I know that right now we don't necessarily have a lot of safe spaces, and it isn't necessarily, and you might actually get negative repercussions for speaking out. Still, I want to encourage you to try to speak up, because the only way we can make change is when people come forward and talk about what's happening to them, report it to the appropriate authorities or the appropriate channels. I want you to remember, if you've been a victim, that it's never the victim's fault. It's not because you did something wrong or you weren't dressed right or you weren't in the right place. It's not because you're too attractive. It's not because you cried. It's not because you were vulnerable. It is always the person who perpetrates the abuse, who breaks the boundary. It's always that person's fault. And we have to create a culture that's safe for people to come forward. Boys, girls, women, and men. It's really important to know that victims don't come forward because they're afraid. They're afraid that nobody's going to believe them. They're afraid that they're going to get retaliation. They're afraid of physical harm and punishment. They're afraid to lose their jobs. They are often made to feel bad for the consequences that the perpetrator will suffer. I can't believe you reported your husband and now he's in jail. I can't believe you reported your employer and now he got fired. What about, I can't believe this person abused you or hurt you in this way? That's a much more appropriate response. Let's just think about each one of us, what we can do to make a difference. what change, based on what we've heard today, or just, just based on your own reflections, what are you willing to do? I want you to just take a minute, think about one thing that you might do differently that will either help somebody feel supported, take some action, maybe in your work, maybe if you are a person at your job that is in a position to develop policies, if people come forward. Maybe you just decide that you're going to teach your children about what's considered abusive behavior and teach your children about boundaries. Maybe you're just going to make a commitment to yourself that if you see something, you're going to say something about it. So at this point, I'm going to pause, and I'm just going to open it up for your questions, and we'll take the next 20 minutes or so for the discussion. And I want you to bear with me as I kind of look at. There's been a lot of comments from the beginning, so I'm just going to kind of scan through and see if there's any questions too. So just bear with me for a minute. And thanks to all of you who have joined. Okay, so there's a question. If someone is being accused of abuse, would you listen to both parties? This is a really, really good question, and it honestly depends on your role. If you're doing an investigation, then yes, you have to listen to both parties. If you're a friend and somebody is just telling you that, their husband is abusing them, you don't necessarily need to go and ask the husband if that's true. But what you can do is refer your friend to an appropriate resource, whether it's counseling, whether it's a domestic violence service provider, somebody that can help the person in a most appropriate manner. It is not always our job to go and do an investigation. We leave the investigating part for people whose role it is to investigate. So it's not always our job to listen to both parties. Only if you're in the position of making some sort of a judgment or issuing some sort of a consequence, then, like if you're a judge, if you're a police officer, if you're on some arbitration committee, then it's necessary to listen to both parties, but otherwise, no, you don't have to. And sometimes it's actually very dangerous if you try to ask an abuser if they really did you really hit your wife? Or I heard, your wife told me that you've been threatening her. That person, the abusive person, will then retaliate and will probably prevent his wife from going out, from talking to you again, and may escalate the level of abuse. So it could actually be dangerous to talk to both parties. Okay. So some of the questions were obviously sent while I was speaking, and I'm not quite sure what I said specifically. Let's see. Someone came to you as a counselor, would you just listen to one side? Again, this is a really good question. So as a therapist, and I am a practicing therapist, as a therapist, my job is not to be an investigator. My job is to provide a safe space for people to work through whatever they're dealing with. And my job is to make sure that people have the resources that they need to make the right decisions as they deal with the situation. It's not my job to do an investigation, and it's not my job to ascertain the facts or the truth because I'm not doing an investigation. My job is to help people heal and to help people recover from the damaging effects of abuse. And so it really depends on the situation, but if there's a situation where, for example, a person comes in and says that during fights, sometimes her husband curses her, maybe she curses him back, and they want to learn better communication skills. If there's no safety issue, if she's not in any danger, then I would definitely want to invite the husband, get his perspective, see if he's willing to learn more communication skills, better communication skills. And so definitely I would want to work with both of them. But if she says, he's got a gun, he's threatened to use it against me, I am not going to call the husband and talk to him directly. I would be compromising my own safety, and I would be compromising her safety at that point. Okay, so there's a question about spiritual abuse that happens among couples with one spouse who is seemingly more knowledgeable about Islam and uses Islam and culture to control the spouse, even the family and children. How do we approach this type of spiritual abuse? It's a great question. It is very common, actually, that people will use whatever they can to get their way. And whenever we do that, we have to be self-aware that we're being manipulative. It's one thing when we're teaching. You know, if we're teaching our children, or even we're teaching our spouse or our friends, what the Quran says, what the Hadith says about any particular topic, this is teaching. But if I'm pulling out a specific Hadith or a specific verse to get you to do what I want, now I'm manipulating the teachings. So we know, for example, that the Prophet, peace be on him, he had some conflicts with his wives. And he could have, in each of those situations, legitimately said, I'm the prophet, I have more authority than you need to do what I say. But we don't have any example of him doing that. In fact, he allowed his wives to complain, to speak their mind, to argue. He brought in a counselor, so to speak, when he brought in his father-in-law to help solve an issue between him and his wife Aisha. Peace and blessings on her. So we always have to be self-aware of when we are just grabbing at something so that we can get our way. When we're just feeling desperate to have our needs met, then the chances are that we're misusing, we're taking advantage of an opportunity, or we're actually misusing, misquoting, which is really a sin. It's a big problem. The way to handle it, I think, is for us to learn better conflict resolution skills, better communication skills, to feel more able to assert ourselves without misusing teachings to manipulate the other person and get our way. All right. So, for example, I've had people say to me as a therapist, as a professional therapist, when they don't want to pay the fees, even though they have a good income, I've had people say to me, but you're Muslim, and Muslims believe in helping each other, and so you should just help me, and you shouldn't charge a fee. That's really manipulative. That's really wrong. And so we have to call it out when we see it, and we have to feel empowered to say this is wrong, and we have to have faith in our teachings and our religion to know that the Prophet, peace be on him, never used religion as a way, like as a weapon, basically. He didn't use it as a weapon. He didn't use it to control people. And our religion is all about our freedom to make our own choices. We know what's right, we know what's wrong, and we have the right to make our own choices, even if the other person disagrees. And if they disagree, now we have to figure out, okay, how are we going to handle this situation? Maybe we can't be friends anymore, maybe we're not going to be partners anymore, whatever it is, but abuse is never the solution. If you report spiritual abuse that happens in the mosque or at the hands of a religious leader, and let's say you report it to the board, or you report it, to whatever the proper channels are, and it's not taken seriously, find someone else to talk to about it. I think we have to acknowledge as a community that the reason people are taking to social media to report their leaders is because they don't have anywhere else to report. Because they're sitting with these really bad feelings, knowing that they were taken advantage of, and people are not either believing them, or people are not holding the perpetrator accountable. So it really is on all of us to work to create our spaces, whatever space we're in, to be a space that has proper channels for addressing abuse. And if your particular, if you report somebody to your board of your mosque and they don't take you seriously, find another imam to make that report to, consult with somebody else so you can brainstorm what are the appropriate channels. If it's a crime, then definitely report it to the police. Unfortunately, we still don't have enough of the proper channels, but we are definitely working on having those channels available. Okay, let me just look through some of, if there's any other questions here. Okay. There's some questions about the perpetrator. I think that these are valid questions. You know, what if the perpetrator is suffering from some sort of mental disorder? What if the perpetrator, you know, has some sort of reason for his behavior? So let's say if we go back to our example in the restaurant, the guy that's sitting next to you, let's say he was hungry. That's all well and good. And when we're hungry, there are other things that we need to do that are more appropriate rather than reach over into someone's plate and grab their food. If a person has a mental disorder or mental illness and that's the cause of their behavior, we definitely want to treat that. We want to help that person. But that is not instead of helping the victim. So we still want to prioritize the safety and well-being of the victim. And once that person is safe, the appropriate, you know, authorities can look into the perpetrator's situation. And if that person needs help, definitely that they should be given help. If they need to be punished, definitely they should be punished. But when somebody comes to us, you know, me and you, and says, you know, this person has hurt me, we don't first go to the perpetrator and find out what their circumstances are. We first make sure the person who's hurt is okay and has what they need, right? I mean, if, let's say, you know, somebody gets shot in front of you and they're bleeding, are you going to go and ask the perpetrator, why did you shoot her? Or are you first going to call the police, make sure that this person is safe? So it's just a matter of what are we prioritizing and where are we putting our focus? I've worked with perpetrators as well, and I can do a whole other program about the psychology of perpetrators. And obviously people are not born, most people are not born to be psychopaths or sociopaths or you know, narcissistic. People are born in one way, and their circumstances and maybe sometimes their genetic makeup contributes to their behavior. But in no way, shape, or form should we ever let a perpetrator off the hook and allow a victim to continue to be victimized. Okay, let me just see if there's anything else. Okay, so there is a question about verse 434. How do I respond to those who say the Quran permits you to lightly beat their wife? So that's really a verse that we can go into great depth in. But for the purpose of this talk, I will just limit it to saying that we have to understand every verse in the Quran in light of other verses in the Quran. So it's a whole package. And that we also use the example of the Prophet's life to illustrate the meanings of the Quran. So that's just general. I think everyone would be in agreement there. So verse 434 really is about the relationship between men and women, in which men have a responsibility towards women. They have a responsibility to take care of women, to ensure that their needs are being met. Financially is a piece that's underlined in that verse, and that women have a responsibility to protect the sort of the privacy and the integrity of the marriage and the family home. And in that leadership position that the husband has, we want to look at the model of the Prophet, peace be on him, of how he exemplified that leadership role. And so it's really, really clear that that leadership role was a servant leadership type of role. It was also a sort of mutual consultation type of relationship where the Prophet was helpful. He asked how he could take care of his family, and he also consulted. So it was never, there's no domination, there's no oppression, there's no, and there's certainly no violence. We also know that in circumstances when the Prophet, peace be on him, had conflict and problems with his wives, that the method that he used was to talk with them, and that he would, there were times when he separated himself from them until the solution became apparent. And we don't have a single instance of him hitting his wife or a child or anyone outside of battle. And so understanding this verse as a sort of a justification for domestic violence is completely inappropriate. There are many people who have done some scholarly research on the meaning of the word daraba in verse 434, which literally means to hit. And it's kind of beyond the scope of this webinar to go into it. But if you look at all the different scholarly interpretations, there really isn't one that will use this verse to justify domestic violence. The verse is actually providing some restrictive steps for a very specific circumstance, which is called nushuz in Arabic, and has a lot of different interpretations in English, but it's some sort of rebellious behavior that would threaten the integrity of the marriage. So, you know, if you tell your wife, I really want you to shop at Wegmans instead of Safeway, and she goes to Safeway or she goes to Target, that is not an opportunity for you to try to apply this verse. This verse is about very serious violations that occur, and there's a very restrictive process. And the third step in that process, which is what you've alluded to, which is what you've mentioned here in the question, has been interpreted in some translations as to beat them lightly. There are many other interpretations of that, including to separate from them or to leave them. There are harsher interpretations as well, just to be honest. But we always look to the example of the Prophet, peace be on him. How did he address conflict? How did he address problems in his marriage? And there is never an example where any sort of violence was used. And so we don't really have the right to do that. And also, if we think about it, in any case that a person tried to hit his wife in order to improve the relationship, in our contemporary society, I just don't see that happening. It won't make your marriage better. If you really want to improve your marriage, talk to each other, get some professional counseling, have somebody intervene. But raising your hand against your spouse is a violation, and it's not going to make your marriage any better. Okay, I'm going to just scroll through and see. Okay, what's the responsibility of someone who knows about the abuse but the victim is not ready to speak up? This is a really, really good question. It's so important because, as I mentioned, you know, the situation can be so complicated for the victim that it may not sometimes be safe to speak up. And a victim, you know, like a victim of serious abuse may be very well aware that if she speaks up, she does increase her risk for further abuse or for retaliation. So really our job in that situation is to be a source of support for the victim. If the victim has confided in you, then you can let the person know that you know how hard the situation is. You could provide phone numbers if it's a domestic violence situation. There's a national hotline, 1-800-799-SAFE, SAFE. There are local domestic violence service providers. There are all kinds of, you know, local hotlines as well. You can provide this person with information. You can provide this person with a listening ear. Just simply being there to hear her story and to let her know that when she's ready, you'll be there for her can be extremely helpful and extremely empowering. Letting her know that, you know, she's not the only person in the situation, that there are a lot of other people. Providing information, you know, whether it's reading material or websites that have information about abuse. It is important that, you know, if somebody's in an abusive relationship, you also know that abusers can be tracking what she's doing on the computer. So, you know, a lot of sites that are run by domestic violence organizations, including ours, Peaceful Families Projects, there's a quick escape button that will delete the history from the computer so that the abusive person can't know what she's up to. But really, you just want to be a listening ear and a believing person. If there is abuse happening where children are involved and children are in danger, then it's really important to bring in other people, depending on your role. So for me as a therapist, I'm a mandated reporter. In most states, if you're a teacher or a healthcare provider, you're a mandated reporter, which means that if you know that a child is in danger, you have to report to Child Protective Services or whatever the appropriate services are in your area. And you can do that anonymously in most cases if that feels safer for you. But you always want to think about, by being silent, what harm am I causing? By knowing that this is happening and not doing anything about it, what harm am I contributing to? If the harm is an adult, then there are boundaries. We can't impose help on somebody that's not ready for help. But we can be there as a support. And it can be really, really hard to watch somebody and know that they're going through an abusive situation and to feel kind of helpless and powerless, like you can't do anything. But it's really important to remind yourself that by listening, you're doing something. By believing, you're doing something. By providing information, you're doing something. And it can take years before a person is ready to take action, because it's just very complicated and there's lots of contradictory feelings. And in the case of an abusive marriage, a lot of times, you know, the victim of the abuse has love and care for the abuser. An abusive person is not an abuser all the time, and not all people who engage in abusive behavior are evil, you know, evil people. Many people who are often good people, mostly good people, violate boundaries, take advantage of situations, knowingly or unknowingly. And that behavior, the abuse, is always bad. It's always wrong. But a person could be sometimes abusive, sometimes not abusive. And so that creates a lot of confusion also for the victim. If I've had good experiences with you and you've taken care of me in some situations, and now you're also hurting me, it can be a little confusing sometimes and challenging to figure out, what do I really want to do with this relationship? Okay. There's a question about boundaries between parents and children, and I would actually like to take that topic as a suggestion for another webinar, because I think it's a whole topic in and of itself. And I appreciate the question. It's really important. So hopefully we will be able to do a webinar specifically addressing parents and children. Okay. Let's see. All right, we got some good comments here. Just going to take a couple more, even though I may not be able to. Not going to be able to answer all of them. Okay, let me just address this here. What do you say when the imam who doesn't say anything because the abuser is president of the board? And I'm going to link that in with Saud's comment of, you know, covering people's sins or covering people's faults. So I said from the beginning, this is complicated, right? It's complicated. And we also know what the right thing is, even if it's a hard thing. We do have teachings as Muslims that encourage us to cover the faults of our believers, right? So of our fellow believers. So if I know that you have a problem with backbiting, or you have a problem with drinking, or you have a problem with not making your prayer on time, I do not need to go and tell anybody about that problem. Okay, I need to cover your faults and hope that you're going to cover mine. However, if your fault is causing harm to someone, is hurting someone, now I have to be informed by a whole other set of teachings which say that we cannot stand by silently when someone is being hurt. We as Muslims have to, and the verse that I used at the very beginning of this, that believing men and believing women are friends and protectors of one another. We enjoin right and we forbid what is wrong. So if somebody's being hurt, and I now remember that also the Quran tells me to stand for justice, and I remember the hadith that says to stop the oppression, then I cannot remain silent, because covering the flaws in that case causes harm. And as a Muslim, we always have to find ways to avoid harm. In the case of, if the person who's causing the harm is the president of the board, or he's the biggest donor in the mosque, or he's my boss, or, he's somebody that carries a lot of weight, of course, these are the more challenging situations. And we have to do the right thing. So in the same way that we want to see our politicians held accountable when they commit injustices and commit what would be considered crimes in any other circumstance, we want to see our president of the board held accountable if he, in most cases, or she, in rare cases, is committing a crime or a violation. We want to see our Quran teachers, our religious leaders held accountable if they are violating other people's rights to being safe, if they are crossing boundaries. And we have to provide support to each other to take those very hard steps of coming forward. And that means that if I take a step forward and I call somebody out or I report someone, it means that all of you need to support me in that and not blame me for now, for example, if it's a big donor to the mosque and now that person no longer comes to the mosque and we don't have his money, I don't need you to blame me for somehow interfering with the income to the mosque. I need you to tell me, thank you for making this mosque a safer place. And we'll do some fundraising. We'll figure out how to get the funding we need. But what we really care about is the well-being of every single person in our community and the safety of every person in our community. So I just want to, I'm going to stop here. I want to let you know that you should check out our website, peacefulfamilies.org. We are looking forward to doing more of these webinars. And we do run our programming with your contribution, with your donation. So please also feel free to contribute to our organization if you like our programming, peacefulfamilies.org. And you can join our newsletter as well from our website if you'd like to be kept up to date about our activities and our events. Thank you so much, and I pray that each of you has been able to take something helpful away from today's conversation, and that you are each committed to doing something to end abuse in our community. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Assalamu alaikum.